Hello, I'm James,
Hi, I'm Jimmy,
and welcome to A Job Done Well.
the podcast that helps you improve your performance and enjoyment at work.
What are we talking about today?
Well, today, James, we are talking about one of the biggest factors of whether you enjoy your job or not, your boss.
All right.
Yeah. You can have a great job and a bad boss ruins it. You can have a really tough job and a good boss can make it really bearable. So today, James, we are going to talk about bad bosses and what do you do when your boss is the problem that's stopping you enjoying and performing at work? And we've had a few of them, haven't we, James?
I've got to try not to get into boss bashing in this episode. Yeah, I'm gonna rise above it. I'll be like Michelle Obama. I'm gonna go high. I know you like a good statistic. I had to look at the statistics. Apparently, and I was rather surprised by this, there was a CIPD report which found that 70% of employees under poor managers report low job satisfaction, as opposed to 88% who reported high job satisfaction under good ones. And the thing that surprised me about that, frankly, was it wasn't a whole lot bigger gap. The other thing is, competent bosses apparently can boost happiness more than salary, according to the Harvard Business Review, and that I do believe.
Yeah.
I used to work with a guy and he said you can't do enough for a good governor, and I thought that was a very astute point.
Well, it's one of the things that we've talked about in a couple of episodes recently. You work for people, you don't work for organisations. You'll run through walls for a good boss. But today we're going to focus on the shadow of that, the bad boss.
The bad boss.
And actually, James, interesting enough, I don't know about you, but this made me reflect on the bad bosses I've experienced. And I reckon that over the space of my career, I had about 50 bosses, right? But I reckon also that only about 10% of them were really bad.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I did a count up as well, and I reckon in 33 years I could remember 22 bosses.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually you're right, 10% bads, only probably 10% good, and the rest probably floats in the middle somewhere.
But the challenge is the disproportionate impact the bad boss has on your working life. It absolutely overshadows it. And I was surprised when I thought about the numbers and the ratio. I'd have said it was a lot higher, not because numerically it was a bit higher, but because of the impact that they have would have been greater in my life, I think.
Yeah, always remember the bad things.
Exactly.
But go on then, what would you say, define a bad boss for me? What is a bad boss?
Well, I think there's a few things that often crop up when you think about this. As somebody who isn't clear, we talk a lot about purpose and clarity around purpose. So I think a boss who isn't clear about why you're here or what they want or the tasks or anything and are inconsistent. So you've had that situation where they blow hot and cold, or sometimes they want lots of detail and sometimes they don't. So you never know really where you stand.
Yeah, and I can't take that, and I go one further. I've worked with some bosses who say they want to do something, and that thing will be, well, it sounds a bit grand, is it morally or ethically correct, but something that everybody else would want to get behind. But they're just giving you lip service when in reality all they're interested in is their bonus. And that always found really difficult. So maybe that's your inconsistency point.
But I think that's an interesting point though, James, because I think we can define some things, but I think some of it is very personal. So in that example you just talked about, I'd hate that because as one of the things I really hate is hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And so if you're saying I'm taking the moral high ground and you're not, that's going to be a problem for me, but that's personal to me. And actually, I bet you if we compared notes on some of the people that I think are bad bosses or you think are bad bosses, we might have some disagreement.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, I can think of at least one individual I thought was a great boss who you didn't like at all. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
One person's good boss is another person's bad.
So one of the things that struck me fairly early on is that seniority and capability are not necessarily the same thing. So you're working for somebody and that person might be 2 or 3 levels above you. But you sit there and you look and you think, bloody hell, do you know what you're doing? So an example from early in my career was just about making decisions. Do you remember BSE? Bovine, spongiform and kefir. Well, when BSE hits, some people won't remember it, but When BSE hit,
We all stopped eating burgers.
I was working for Birds. I was working for a beef burger company at the time. People just weren't eating beef burgers, which Birds Eye is a big deal. And so we had to pretty much did it on a dime, but we switched from making beef burgers to hamburgers, right? Because ham's fine. But I needed an order for 10,000 tons of pork, because you do, right? It's a lot of dead pigs. But the business group chairman was incapable of making a decision. Now it's clocking on through May, getting in towards burger making season, and I needed the pork, otherwise we weren't making no burgers. And he wouldn't make a decision about it at all. So just incapable of deciding. I think it was probably fear. He was probably worried about his profit targets.
Yeah.
But that for me is one key thing, just this inconsistency.
A few other things I've experienced in terms of bad bosses. People who are overly controlling. You can't do anything. Don't let you make any decisions. Don't let you take any actions. I think people who are completely absent, they're never around, particularly when things get tough. They're not sighted with a radar. I think people who are overly political. We've talked a few times about people who are very good at managing upwards, but they don't manage downwards quite as effectively.
Yeah, I said I was going to go to the Michelle Obama and go high.
You're going to go low.
I'll go low. There was one bloke I worked for, and every 3 months he'd have an operational review with his boss, and we'd all get dragged in to present about how good we were doing. And he'd just talk over the top of us. He would make shit up if he thought it sounded good. And you'd be really caught, because on the one hand, you'd think to yourself, well, if that's what you want to say, you crack on and say it. But on the other hand, he was just creating huge holes that you knew were going to fall in afterwards. So that was quite stressful.
You said quite early on, you discovered that capability and seniority didn't always correlate. It took me quite a while to realize that. Went through naively thinking that the bosses in senior roles knew best. And it was only when I got a little bit closer to them that I realized that actually they often didn't. They just made up for the lack of capability with confidence at times.
Well, and so I shouldn't get political, but you can see this and what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. Yeah. Most powerful white man in the world probably isn't a great boss. Let's be honest about it.
No problem about it, James. He ain't a great boss, and he ain't even a great human being, frankly.
But the other thing, coming away from the politics for a second, the other thing which I think is important is values. So somebody might actually be a very capable boss, but they don't share the same values as you, then you really struggle. So for a while, I worked for a marketing lady. We were running a big project. She was a senior marketing lady. But my values were all about operational effectiveness. They would be, given where I came from. She couldn't give two hoots about that because it just wasn't her makeup. And it's not that she was bad to work for. It just became really difficult because you saw the world from a totally different perspective.
I think another example of what I consider to be a bad boss, and this is maybe in hindsight a little bit, I've worked for a number of people who, when you were working for them and they needed something from you, they were like your best friend and you were the greatest thing since sliced bread. As soon as they didn't need anything from you, you were dead to them. There's a few people we know like that.
Yeah, I think we could name names and have some congruence there, but maybe now is not the place to do it.
That's some of the traits that we've seen. But as we say, it can be a little bit personal. But I guess, why do you think it's so hard when you have a bad boss?
I think for me, if I was to give an analogy, it's all about control and delivery, right? So on the one hand, it's a bit like you're the captain of a sailing ship. Yeah. So you've got to get this ship from wherever it is to India or whatever it might be, yeah? But you don't control the winds. So on the one hand, you've got the boss and they will control your priorities and they'll control your resources and they'll control your progression. But then they're still holding you accountable. They love that words, yeah? But you've got to deliver, you've got to lead your team, you've got to make things work. And it's that discontinuity between, I suppose, accountability and control, which is the thing that really causes a problem.
No, I think you're right, James. I think they have such a control and impact on your life, what you're working on, how you're judged, how you get on, how you get promoted, what your end of year review is on a daily basis and just on a whole life basis. But you have to do all the work often.
But then, as you said, over the past 33 years, you've had how many, 50 bosses? I think you got through a rate twice as fast as me, actually. I was obviously more stable than you were. But I had a 20 plus. I mean, either which way, that's what, a boss every year and a half on average. But even given the churn of bosses, they do have real world consequences, right? So there is that phrase, people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses, but it is so true, right? So I think there's some Gallup data that supports that. But I was thinking about it, and I have moved jobs internally 3 times because I've had a bad boss, and I've
Yeah.
moved jobs externally twice because I had a bad boss, right? So it is not great when you have one, and people do leave. So
Yeah. Well, I think if I looked at the 10% of times when I had a bad boss, I think I moved every time after a while. Having said that, so we talked a bit about bad bosses and what they're like and why it's difficult. But I do think that when you're working for a bad boss, there are some of the common traps that we fall into. For example, when you've got a bad boss, I found out I didn't want to talk to them. So you just avoid them. You avoid those difficult conversations. Back to your point about telling them they're making shit up. I mean, did you tell them? You know, exactly. You avoid those difficult conversations, don't you?
Yeah. And is that a trap or is that just inevitable? I'm not sure. I mean, it depends whether or not the boss is vindictive. But actually, I think of all the bosses that I would propel, well, to be honest with you, mate, so I used to work for you, and I have on occasion told you were making shit up.
Yeah.
But I knew you could take it. And
Yeah.
so therefore, by definition, you weren't a bad boss.
No, but I think that just the principle of, do you have the conversations you need to have? Do you talk to your boss about why you're finding them difficult? Do you talk to them about why some of their behavior is difficult?
It takes bravery.
It does. And so I think we often avoid those conversations. I think then that leads to you can get caught in reinforcing their behavior. So agreeing with all of their points. Back to your mate, the orange lunatic, everyone around him is agreeing with everything he tells them all the time.
Well, and that's very interesting, isn't it? Because it must be causing some of them extreme stress. Yeah. And, fascinating. There's one guy very senior in the Pentagon who's been in the push and short order, who clearly wasn't telling them what they wanted to hear. But when you're in a situation like that, he's trying to protect his soldiers' lives, I have no doubts. Yeah. And not doing that is just hugely stressful. And unfortunately, I only ever worked in an insurance company and a bank, right? So I wasn't in that position. But when somebody is, well, we talked about it the other day, when somebody's fundamentally, you've got a values conflict, it is really, really hard.
Yeah. I think another couple of traps that we can get caught in, one is like, it's bitching about your boss. You end up talking to some of your colleagues.
I wouldn't have said that was a trap. I would have said that was a pleasure.
Well, yeah, you would though, James. But I think part of that is it can be cathartic to understand that we're all in the same position. We all feel the same way. But sometimes it doesn't actually help move you forward. It doesn't help you progress things a lot of the time. So I think there is a risk with that at times.
Well, there is also a risk that your boss could find out about it, quite frankly, and that's not terribly helpful. My daughter worked for a while for one person, and she noted that everybody in the entire organization used to bitch and complain about them. It's what singled this woman out. And in a one way, that's great. It's cathartic because you're not the only one. But it's a bit toxic. It doesn't really take you anywhere. It's not proactive in any way.
No, and I think that can often lead to, you can become just a bit cynical and a bit disengaged. And one of the things that always worried me personally is when I found myself working for a bad boss and I found myself becoming very negative, I didn't like myself then. And I worried that when I went somewhere else, I'd carry on being the same. That wasn't true because once I moved, I didn't carry it on, but I always worried that I'd get myself in a downward spiral, and could I get myself out of that? So I think that's easy to become.
And just it's quite easy to become very cynical and disengaged from the situation, which again isn't helpful.
I think one of the things is a bit of a mixed blessing is, as you said, James, we've both been through lots of numbers of bosses. You get tempted into kind of waiting it out, and because they'll move eventually, won't they? And that is true, but that still can lead to a very difficult, toxic time for you if you don't sort of take some action.
Well, and that's interesting because I think that is the common strategy and understandable. But if we are right that 10% of bosses are bad bosses, are rough rule of thumb, that means 10% of the population is waiting out at work, and that really is a dreadful thought.
Yeah. And just before we get on to what you can do about it, though, would you have ever said that you were a bad boss?
Never. But
Go polish your halo.
whether I'd say it or whether I knew it, I'm sure I frustrated the hell out of people sometimes, not intentionally.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things is I think sometimes bad bosses aren't intentionally bad bosses.
No, a lot of them are.
You know
Well,
what I mean?
most of them are intentionally bad bosses.
No, I don't think they get up in the morning and you think, today I'm going to be a really bad boss. I think it is just whether it's just their lack of confidence, lack of capability. It could be a whole raft of things that are impacting them, but you don't get up and that's what you aim. And I'm sure there are people definitely who I've worked with who would say that I was a bad boss. And that might have been how we worked together. If I look back, I was always too focused on results. And I probably didn't focus on the people that worked for me as well as I could have done. And that would have pissed some people off in the past. So I don't think it's an intentional thing.
Yeah,
So-
I'd like to think I had the humility to be able to accept it when somebody told me I was a bad boss. That I can think of 3 or 4 people who thought I was a really bad boss. And sometimes you just clash, don't you?
Yeah. But I think that the danger with that is, though, James, is back to the point about you don't always have those conversations.
Yeah,
That's the
sure.
difficulty. People who found you as a bad boss probably weren't telling you.
What have you done in the past that you think made things worse when you've had a bad boss?
I think a couple of things that I've probably done in the past, I'd be schizophrenic with it. Either I would have to lock horns with them. And if they were talking bullshit, as you said earlier, I'd feel that I've got to put them right. I've got to make them realize how stupid they are and how destructive they are. Or I'd withdraw. And I just wouldn't want to, I'd try and find ways of keeping out their way and not engaging with them and staying out of the way. And I think both of those 2 extremes are reactions I would have had. I think they probably made things worse at times with certain bosses because then they felt, right, if you're gonna rebel against me, we'll see you. You end up just clashing heads too much.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the Pygmalion effect?
No, go on, educate me.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I have gone from being golden balls to Mr. Satan within the space of about 2 weeks, only because my boss has changed, right?
Yeah.
So my performance didn't change, my boss changed, and therefore my boss's perception of me changed. And they're entitled to that perception. But what I found is that if somebody thinks you're a poor performer, you start acting like a poor performer.
Yeah.
You shut down, you don't engage, you leave early, you don't push on the things that you should think. And it really is, I think that's the worst thing, is when you get so hung up in your boss and their perception of you, and it causes you to spiral down the way. And that, I think, is the thing that you really need to watch out for.
So let's get on to some of the things that actually work. So we talked about some of our reactions and how that didn't help. Give me an example, James, of some of the things that you think do work.
Sorry, it's a bit trite, cliche. All these things are cliches because they're not the truth in them. But walk in their shoes for a little while. Yeah, understand what is driving them. The bloke I was telling you about, the bloke who wasn't prepared to order 5,000 pounds of pork, 5,000 tons of pork. Yeah, he was just worried about profit. Yeah, he was worried he's going to have a dirty, great big write-off in his hands. It was a bit young and inexperienced, truth be told. So what did we do? We ordered it 1,000 tons ago, right? So we just minimised his risk. At which point he was bang up for it. So just understanding what pressures people are under and trying to understand them helps inordinately.
And I remember I was working for a person and it was their first time at that level, and they were worrying about detail and governance and how we wrote board papers and God knows what else. And I never really thought, well, maybe they lacked a bit of confidence and they were stepping up. And I know when I stepped up to more senior roles, you often do lack that little bit of confidence. Now, you won't always say, because you lack confidence, you can't always say, look, I'm finding this really difficult. This job's tough. I'm going to take a bit of time getting used to it. Because you don't have that confidence. So you mask it. And just thinking, oh, actually, what's going on for that person, whether that's they've just stepped up to do that job, or often what's happening for them outside of work.
I worked for one woman, she was an absolute horror, as far as I was concerned. Turns out she was going through a very messy divorce at the time, which of course I didn't know about, but is it any surprise she was a bit erratic at work? So you're right, understanding what's going on for them, really important.
I think another angle to understanding them is understanding what's important to them. So what matters to them. What some people, it's making a difference. It's it's that classic what's in it for me, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you don't understand what matters to them, it's very difficult to then feel that you're helping them.
Well, there's something in make life easy for them.
Yeah.
Clarity, updates, no surprises, all of that sort of stuff.
Do you remember one of our most favourite bosses, who he used to love to be? He always, when he went into big meetings, he wanted to be over prepared.
Yeah.
His infamous back pocket.
Okay.
He wanted so much information, and it was absolute pain in the arse. But we used to do it for him because we knew that made him more comfortable to perform and do well and represent us as a team more effectively. We wouldn't just sit there and say, "Why are you asking for this? Why do you want this? Why do you want that?" We just used to give him loads of stuff to make him more comfortable, didn't we?
Yeah. And I remember that sort of the opposite of that in one session, like fairly early in my career. I was working with somebody and we had a big development review meeting where all the great and the good are in the meeting room. And this woman just tore a strip off me in front of everyone. She tore a strip off me. But it wasn't for what, because I'd done the wrong thing. It was because I hadn't told her I was going to do the wrong thing. And she just felt really exposed. So the whole thing about no surprises is really important. If you've got a boss who's a bit edgy and doesn't like to find things out, best to keep them absolutely on the front foot when things aren't going quite the way you expect them to go.
So I think there's something about understanding them as a person. There's something about making their life easier. But I also think we did an episode quite a while ago about managing upwards. But I think just having some structure and plan to how you manage your boss, just things like, you said they don't like surprises, and it's true, but don't just bring them problems, bring them some options. What can you do? What are some of the things that could be solutions? When they ask you to do something, be clear on what their expectations are. What does good look like? What's success? Don't wait till you're halfway through and then say, "Is this what you wanted?" That used to infuriate me. You haven't said anything, so I thought you understood what I wanted. And then you get to the end and they bring you all this stuff and it's like, no, that's not what I wanted. So clarify those expectations. And sometimes you have to write stuff down. I used to find it quite useful with one boss when we used to discuss things and he'd knock stuff around. You weren't sure exactly what you'd agreed. I used to write to them and just say, "James, just to confirm, I'm going to do X, Y, Z for you."
Yeah, the old CYA note. But CYA, cover your ass.
Okay.
But actually, when done well, very powerful.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't.
People to think. Forces people to think.
But yeah, it's getting the right tone though, because a lot of this underlying, a lot of it comes down to communication. If your tone is, "I'm covering my back," then that's going to bristle. If it is, "Look, I really want to do a good job for you. I'm clarifying. This is what I think you're looking for." It's a whole different ballgame.
So is that where I always went wrong? Tone, is that the problem?
Yeah, if you just discovered tone, real tone's not a person. Do you think it was like?
Maybe now you tell me. As a master of the dark arts, how do you push back on a boss properly?
I think you have to not get caught like I did, which is get caught in locking horns. You have to push back in a very kind of logical, calm, at the right time. So there are times when don't push back, just let them run, just let them go. Then find your right time where you think they're going to be open to it and present options, present logic, present some of the facts with things, not in a defensive way, but tie it back to what's in it for them. How do you want to move things forward? You understand what matters to them. Therefore, you're pushing back, you're being logical about your pushback for the sake of what matters to them.
Yeah. So, one more thing that I would add, and I suppose this is me, hardly surprising, can look at it systematically, right? Control what you can, right? You can worry about your team, you can worry about your communication, you can worry about your standards, right? If your boss is a complete arse, there's probably not a lot you can do about it. So therefore, it's almost not worth your time worrying about it. So I think it's almost like look at a bad boss as just another systems constraint. You can't change it, but what can you do? Worry about what you can do rather than what you can't.
Yeah. So I think there's some practical things you can do, but I do think we should probably spend a couple of minutes, James, talking about the elephant in the room a lot of the time when it comes to bosses. And that is a lot of the behavior and the reactions and the actions are driven by power and ego at times.
Yeah. Okay. Then, so do you think? I mean, they do say, what is it? Power corrupts absolute. Power corrupts absolutely. But do you think power corrupts bosses? Then is that where you're going with this or not?
Well, I think it does. I think not just it corrupts, but I think when you get promoted, back to my example of somebody who was promoted to a senior role, they felt that they had to show that they were in charge and that they knew what they were doing. So I don't think it was coming from a point of corruption. I think sometimes it can be, I've got to step up. I've got to be the boss. I've got to be this person that has all the answers. So yeah, I do think that it does. It can change people without a doubt.
I think it's this whole thing about 360 feedback. In my experience, 360 feedback does not flipping exist unless you have to be the bottom of the flipping rung, right?
Yeah,
Because you get feedback from the top, but actually, it's, the higher people go, the less honest feedback they tend to get about their performance. And so, if you're not getting the feedback, if you don't know the implications of what you are doing, then it can't help but change your behaviour, can it?
yeah. Do you remember the session that a certain boss of ours had with us when he sat down and wanted us to tell him honestly about all the things that were wrong with something and speak openly? And
I don't, but I must have blanked it from my mind. Keep going.
and we did, we did,
Yeah, that's probably
and
what.
he was our boss's boss. So
No,
we had
hang on.
with
Yeah,
him.
yeah.
We talked to him openly about everything, and he thanked us and was very appreciative. And then afterwards, went to our actual boss and said, "Your team are awful. They're all very negative." So, but that's what you just asked for. So that's one of the reasons why often people in senior levels do not get honest feedback because of the fear of consequence.
What about ego then? Is there something about ego which actually gets people promoted? By which I mean, some of the jobs I've seen, people have very big jobs, but you've got to have a fair size ego to want the flipping job in the first place.
Well, yeah, to believe that you can do that job, you've got to have an amount of ego. I mean, nobody gets to being CEO, prime minister, president, or whatever
Yeah,
without
without
any ego. It's just the reality of it. But I think if you go further down the organization, I think that ego often shows up in things like not listening, not wanting to admit to your mistakes, the needing to be right. I mean, one guy wanted to always be the cleverest man in the room. It didn't care.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
did not care whether the meeting was absolutely shit and the outcomes were awful. If he had proven that he was the cleverest man in the room, he went out of that room happy. And that's pure ego.
I think another big one actually is insecurity, right?
Yeah.
Because people who are in these positions, there is the whole imposter syndrome, and then they become insecure, and then because they're insecure, they just revert to what they know, and then you just start to get a whole load of them control and micromanagement, ever checking, and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, and I don't think that helps.
No. And I think there are, though, a few practical things that you can do when dealing with power and ego. I think some good examples. You have to remember that often being a senior person is the person's identity is tied up in all of that. So challenge some of the facts and the outcomes.
Okay,
Why not challenge the person's
yeah, don't
identity?
challenge the individual. Yeah, I
No.
totally agree.
And one of the great mentors I had used to say, you've got to give people's ego the chance to retreat. So if you're trying to prove a point, you've got to give their ego the chance to back down or change their mind. If you make it too big a jump, their ego won't let them change their mind.
And we all know this to be true. I mean, sorry to go back to the current political situation, but if you listen to the political pundits, the term they go over and over about is where's the off ramp? And the whole thing being politicians need an off ramp. They need to find a way of getting out of this where they can save face. And actually, the trick is very often to give them the off ramp so that they don't feel stupid. Yeah, no,
exactly. And you can let them change their mind, let their ego allow them to that. Sometimes you have to let them have a win. It's just the reality of things that sometimes the goal isn't always to be right. It's to get the right outcome. So let them have the kind of wins at times.
yeah.
I think then the other thing is, do pick your battles. I mean, back to my point about how the trap I used to get caught in, I almost felt that every time a boss opened their mouth and said something that was bullshit, I had to call the bullshit. Whereas actually, not every hill is worth dying on.
Yeah. I didn't die in hills, mate. I died in ditches, but I died in quite a lot of ditches.
Exactly. But
And
pick your battle.
Absolutely. We could not agree more strongly.
But I think, it's back again to just understand the pressure they're under. Is it, back to my example, the ego that doesn't let you say, I'm struggling with this, I find this job difficult. So I think some of the things that you can do around dealing with power and ego, don't challenge them as a person, challenge the outcomes, give them the odd win and pick your battles, but also just understand them a little bit as a person, the pressure they're under.
Yeah, put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah.
So what do you do then when it's not fixable? And actually, I don't think it's that not fixable that often. I mean, I can think in my 33 years, I can only think of one who was it was never going to happen. A handful, which were bad, but one who was terrible. But when you do get in that situation, what do you think?
Well, I think there are a few ways that you can deal with it when it isn't fixable. I mean, we've talked about something, you can adapt your approach and you can accept it. You can work around their issues. But ultimately, for me, I worked with some people I didn't always see eye to eye with. And I would do those things, but ultimately, sometimes you do have to move on. And we both said that there were a number of times, you can't just like jack in a job sort of thing. We don't have that luxury in life. But I knew when I worked with a bad boss, I would adapt, I would work around, but ultimately I knew that if they weren't going anywhere, I had to.
So sometimes the only solution is to leave. Yeah. Just space into that.
So we talked about bad bosses. We've given a bit of flavour of how they behave, why it's difficult, some of the practical things that you can do about it. Talked about power and ego and how you can deal with that. But out of all of that, James, what's the one thing that you would pick out and share with somebody who's dealing with a bad boss today?
No matter how bleak it feels, he or she will not be there forever. So worry about what you can do and don't worry about the boss because you can't change him. So just worry about what you can do. They'll go.
And I think the one thing
I've got two bits of advice in there. Cunningly,
two for the price of one.
Yeah, very good.
Well, the one thing I'd pick on is I think a lot of the issues and the solutions come down to communication. So I think just really thinking very carefully about how you communicate with somebody, I think can give you a lot more options. So there you go. If anyone's dealing with a bad boss, hopefully that's been helpful because invariably it will happen to you. Right. Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Speak to you later. Cheers.
We cover a whole host of topics on this podcast,
from purpose to corporate jargon,
but always focused on one thing, getting the job done well.
Easier said than done. So if you've got unhappy customers or employees, bosses or regulators breathing down your neck,
if your backlogs are out of control and your costs are spiraling, and that big IT transformation project that you've been promised just keeps failing to deliver,
we can help. If you need to improve your performance, your team's performance, or your organisation's, get in touch at jimmy@ajobdonewell.com
or james@ajobdonewell.com.